When we begin with the reported incident itself, we need to understand not just the bare facts, but also the psychological and symbolic weight behind them. Israel is said to have carried out a targeted strike in Doha, the capital of Qatar, with the stated objective of hitting Hamas leadership. At first glance, this seems like another headline in the ongoing cycle of Middle Eastern conflict, yet it is far more revealing than it appears. The very idea of targeting political or military figures outside of the traditional battlefield stretches the conflict beyond borders. It communicates that safety is not merely about physical location, that even in places once thought of as neutral ground, the reach of warfare can extend. Hamas's response to this strike was immediate. They claimed that none of their leaders were harmed. Now, we could take this at face value, or we could read between the lines. What does it mean when a group announces survival as its first reaction? It is not just an update on casualties. It is a performance of resilience. It is a message to their supporters that they remain unshaken, that Israel may have the tools of war but cannot take away the image of continuity, of strength. That in itself is a psychological battlefield. The strike was intended to eliminate leadership, but if leadership emerges claiming survival, the narrative becomes inverted. The hunter has failed, and the hunted has endured. For Israel, however, the operation communicates something equally deliberate. It suggests that their strategy is no longer confined to Gaza or even the broader Palestinian territories. It projects an image of omnipresence, of an intelligence network and military capacity that knows no geographical restraint. From the perspective of psychological warfare, this tells Hamas, you may hide anywhere, even in friendly territory, and we can still reach you. The power here is not just in what happened, but in what could have happened. Whether or not leaders were actually killed is almost secondary to the chilling reminder of vulnerability. Now, let's consider the symbolic weight of Qatar as the chosen location. Doha is not a battlefield. It is a modern city that prides itself on diplomacy, wealth, and global influence. By allowing such an incident to take place on its soil, the narrative is complicated. Was Qatar caught off guard? Was its sovereignty disregarded? Or was it simply powerless to prevent what happened? For the people of the region, this creates a deeper unease. If a place like Doha can be touched, where is safe? If mediating states cannot control the conflict crossing their borders, what happens to the illusion of stability? Philosophically, this moment raises questions about what it means to be secure in a world where war is no longer bound to geography. The modern human condition is marked by a kind of rootless vulnerability. We may find shelter, but not certainty. Power, in this sense, is not only about weapons, but about the psychological reach of fear and the illusion of safety. Israel's strike was not just military, it was existential. Hamas's denial of casualties was not just defensive, it was symbolic defiance. In this clash of narratives, one projecting inevitability of reach, the other projecting inevitability of survival, we see the core of the modern conflict. Wars today are fought not just in streets or skies, but in minds. They are fought in the images people hold of themselves, their leaders, their enemies, and the very possibility of peace. And so, this single reported incident, stripped of context, might appear inconclusive. No leaders dead, no territory lost. But beneath the surface, it has already reshaped the story being told. Safety is fragile, power is psychological, and survival is as much about perception as it is about reality. The truth of war now lies less in what is destroyed and more in what people are made to believe. That is the battlefield we must pay attention to. When we move from the immediate details of the strike to the broader picture, we begin to see why this incident carries such profound weight. The fact that it happened in Doha is not incidental, it changes the texture of the entire conflict. Qatar, for years, has positioned itself as something of a mediator in the Middle East. It has hosted negotiations, offered itself as a neutral space and tried to balance its ties between powers that often find themselves at odds. So when violence suddenly touches the surface of that polished image, it is more than just another military operation. It is a disruption of a narrative that Qatar has spent years building about itself, a narrative of stability, diplomacy, and relative immunity from the turmoil that surrounds it. Think about what that means psychologically for the region. For many, Doha has symbolized a kind of sanctuary, wealth, modernity, and safety within a volatile landscape. To see it become a stage, even briefly, for the same patterns of conflict that scar Gaza or Lebanon, is to realize that the boundaries between safe and unsafe are more fragile than we like to believe. The strike was not just against Hamas, it was indirectly against the perception of Qatar as untouchable. And perception in international politics is sometimes more powerful than reality. Israel's choice of Doha as a target carries another implication. It forces a recalibration of Qatar's identity in the eyes of the world. If Qatar continues to host Hamas figures, it can no longer plausibly claim full neutrality. If it distances itself, it risks losing influence in the very conflicts that have given it leverage on the global stage. Either way, the strike has placed Qatar in a position where it must respond, not militarily, but symbolically. The question is not whether Doha can defend itself against such incursions, but whether it can preserve its image as a credible broker of peace when the war has now arrived on its doorstep. There is a deeper philosophical point here, too. Neutrality is always more fragile than it appears. Nations often imagine themselves as separate from the conflicts of others, as if wealth or diplomacy can build a wall high enough to keep chaos out. But what this incident illustrates is that neutrality is not a natural condition. It is a performance, a balancing act, and one that can be undone with a single act of violence. Qatar's role as mediator was never an inherent quality. It was a story the region and the world agreed to believe. Israel's strike in Doha has, in one moment, tested that story. Will people still see Qatar as impartial after this? Or will the illusion of neutrality begin to fray? This matters because the Middle East does not operate only through weapons. It operates through stories. Every nation tells a story about itself, of strength, of survival, of independence, of moral authority. For Qatar, the story has been one of diplomacy and balance. For Israel, it is one of vigilance and pursuit. For Hamas, it is one of endurance against overwhelming odds. When these stories collide, what actually happens on the ground is often less decisive than what people believe about what happened. Doha was not destroyed, no leaders were lost, but the story of Qatar as a secure, neutral host has been cracked. And a crack in a story can sometimes be more dangerous than a crack in a wall. So when we speak of the geopolitical significance of this strike, we are really speaking about the fragility of narratives in the modern world. Borders are less powerful than perceptions, and neutrality less permanent than it seems. Israel may have been targeting Hamas, but in doing so, it also struck at the very idea of safe spaces in the region. The lesson here is sobering. No nation, however wealthy or diplomatic, can fully insulate itself from the gravity of conflict. And when the illusion of neutrality shatters, what follows is rarely stability. It is a reshuffling of roles, of stories, of alliances. That is why this incident matters. It is not just a military action. It is a reminder that in the modern world, no sanctuary is ever absolute. If we now shift our focus to Israel's strategy, the picture becomes even more revealing. This strike in Doha is not just an isolated event. It is part of a broader pattern that tells us something about Israel's evolving approach to Hamas. For decades, the conflict has been primarily defined by borders: Gaza, the West Bank, southern Lebanon. These were the expected arenas of struggle, the maps upon which both sides drew their lines. Yet what we see here is an expansion of the battlefield. Israel is signaling that the confrontation with Hamas will not be contained within those traditional boundaries. Leadership, wherever it exists, is considered within reach. From a strategic standpoint, this communicates two powerful messages. First, it tells Hamas that the notion of sanctuary is dissolving. The idea that leaders can retreat to places like Doha to live under the protection of wealth and diplomacy is being challenged. It is a way of saying distance does not equal safety. And second, it tells the world that Israel views Hamas not as a local adversary confined to Gaza's borders, but as a transnational organization whose influence and operations extend beyond Palestinian soil. By extending its pursuit, Israel is reframing the conflict from a territorial dispute into something more akin to a global hunt. But beneath the strategic surface, there is also a psychological game at play. By striking in a city like Doha, Israel aims to cultivate an image of omnipresence, the sense that it can watch, track, and act anywhere. This has less to do with killing any particular leader and more to do with creating an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. To live under the shadow of that uncertainty, to know that even in exile, even in luxury, one might be targeted, is to carry a burden that cannot be easily measured in political terms. It is a kind of slow erosion of confidence, designed not just to weaken an organization, but to undermine its spirit. Hamas, of course, responds to this differently. It thrives on portraying itself as unbroken, even in the face of direct threats. When Israel projects its reach, Hamas projects its resilience. Yet the very need to perform resilience shows the effectiveness of Israel's tactic. The group must constantly reassure its followers that it is unshaken. The battlefield, then, is not only about strikes and counterstrikes, but about performances of strength, each side crafting an image for its audience. Israel wants to be seen as inevitable, unstoppable. Hamas wants to be seen as untouchable, unbreakable. And in that clash of images, the truth often becomes secondary. Philosophically, what we are witnessing here is the transformation of warfare itself. In older times, wars were fought on front lines, and victories were measured in captured land or defeated armies. But in this new model, victory is measured by perceptions, by how fear, uncertainty, and resilience are distributed across populations. Israel's strategy against Hamas leadership is not simply about removing individuals, it is about reshaping the psychology of what it means to be in opposition. It is about turning every place into a potential battlefield, every moment into a test of vigilance. The unsettling reality is that this expansion of reach changes not only the dynamics of the conflict, but also the human condition within it. Leaders are no longer leaders in exile. They are leaders in hiding. Cities once considered neutral become shadows of uncertainty. And the ordinary people who watch this unfold, both in the region and across the world, are reminded that power in the modern age is not about lines on a map, but about the ability to collapse the distinction between near and far, safe and unsafe. This is why Israel's strategy must be understood beyond the language of military efficiency. It is not just about who lives or dies, it is about who controls the psychological space of possibility. To make an enemy believe that nowhere is safe is to hold a kind of power that transcends weapons. And so, the strike in Doha is not merely another chapter in a long war. It is a statement of intent, a declaration that the conflict itself is borderless. The question that lingers is whether a war without borders can ever produce peace with boundaries. When we turn to Hamas's narrative and response, the picture grows more layered, because in conflicts like this, survival is not only about staying alive, it is about how survival is portrayed, how it is spoken, how it is made visible to the world. Hamas's immediate declaration that no leaders were harmed in the Doha strike was not a neutral piece of information. It was a crafted statement, a deliberate act of communication. In saying, "We are untouched," the group was not simply reporting on events. It was constructing an image of resilience, designed to reassure supporters and frustrate opponents. What is striking here is that survival, when claimed publicly, becomes almost theatrical. Even if it is true that no one was killed, The speed and certainty with which Hamas delivered the message makes it less about fact and more about framing. They are saying, our leadership cannot be touched, our cause cannot be shaken, and even Israel's reach cannot undermine our continuity. It is a way of transforming what could have been read as vulnerability into a kind of defiance. In this sense, the denial is less about bodies and more about morale. This is a dynamic that has always existed in asymmetrical conflicts. A weaker group, militarily speaking, must compensate by amplifying symbolic victories. For Hamas, every survival becomes proof of destiny. Every escape becomes a demonstration of endurance. When Israel strikes and fails to achieve its stated objective, Hamas seizes the opportunity to invert the story. Instead of being on the defensive, they claim to stand victorious. And in the eyes of their supporters, this shift of narrative can be as potent as a battlefield triumph. From a psychological perspective, this tells us something important about how human beings experience conflict. We do not only respond to material conditions, we respond to meaning. A building can be destroyed, but if the story told afterward is one of resilience, the destruction loses part of its sting. A leader can be targeted, but if that leader emerges unscathed and visible, the failed attempt strengthens their aura rather than diminishes it. Hamas understands this logic well, and so its messaging is aimed at turning each survival into a kind of myth. But there is also a danger embedded within this performance of resilience. By insisting they are unbroken, Hamas risks creating a narrative in which their value is measured by endurance alone. In doing so, they may fuel cycles of escalation where each attack is met not with reflection, but with another symbolic act of defiance. Philosophically, it raises the question of whether resilience without transformation is enough. To endure is admirable, but if endurance simply leads to more suffering, what is actually being preserved? A movement, an identity, or merely the repetition of pain? At the same time, Israel's strategy and Hamas's counter-narrative intersect in a strange dance. Israel projects omnipresence, Hamas projects invulnerability. Israel says we can reach you anywhere. Hamas replies, you can reach us, but you cannot break us. Neither side is speaking only to each other. They are both speaking to wider audiences, to their citizens, to their allies, to the world watching. And here, the battle of images becomes as decisive as the battle of weapons. This reveals something essential about modern conflict. Truth becomes secondary to perception. What matters most is not whether the strike was successful in military terms, but whether it is perceived as successful or unsuccessful in the eyes of those who matter. Hamas knows that to admit vulnerability is to risk unraveling the psychological thread that binds its supporters. Israel knows that to admit limits is to weaken its deterrence. So each constructs a narrative that stretches reality to its advantage. In the end, what we are left with is not clarity, but a clash of illusions. Resilience and reach, survival and omnipresence. These are ideas designed to fill the gaps left by uncertainty. And yet, in this clash of narratives, the real tragedy is that people begin to live more in stories than in truths, more in the shadow of symbols than in the substance of peace. That is why this moment matters. It reminds us that in war, survival is not simply about who lives. It is about who controls the meaning of living. When we widen the lens beyond Israel and Hamas, we begin to see how an incident like this ripples outward, unsettling not just the immediate players, but the broader landscape of regional and international politics. A strike in Doha is not confined to the question of who was or was not killed. It forces states, alliances, and mediators to reconsider their positions. Qatar, in particular, now finds itself in a precarious position. For years, it has balanced carefully, offering itself as a host for negotiations, as a financial supporter of reconstruction, as a space where dialogue can occur even between bitter rivals. This dual role gave Qatar influence far greater than its size might suggest. But influence is fragile when neutrality comes under fire. The strike places Qatar at a crossroads. If it continues to host Hamas figures, it risks appearing complicit or at least permissive, which could strain its relationships with Western allies or with regional states seeking a more direct confrontation with Hamas. Yet if it distances itself from Hamas in order to protect its global standing, it risks losing credibility as a trusted mediator in the eyes of Palestinians and others who see Qatar as one of the few spaces sympathetic to their cause. Either choice reshapes the balance of diplomacy. In this sense, the strike is not only about leadership, it is about eroding the scaffolding of mediation that has held fragile talks together. The implications extend even further. For Israel, the strike demonstrates a willingness to test the boundaries of international norms. Targeting figures in Doha is not just a matter of operational reach. It challenges the idea of state sovereignty in one of the world's wealthiest and most politically visible capitals. The message is unmistakable. In pursuit of Hamas, Israel is willing to unsettle even its indirect partners. That creates unease not just in Qatar but in other states that may quietly host exiled figures or opposition movements. It suggests that no country can be certain of insulating itself from the reach of conflict if it becomes, even tangentially, a safe haven for those Israel considers enemies. Globally, the reaction is equally layered. Observers in Europe, the United States, and beyond are watching closely, not because of the immediate military consequences, but because of the precedent it sets. Every strike of this nature raises the question of escalation. If conflicts can now spill so easily into supposedly neutral spaces, then the lines between war zones and diplomatic capitals begin to blur. And when those lines blur, the risk of miscalculation rises dramatically. A conflict that was once framed as local or regional begins to carry the texture of something more volatile, more global. Psychologically, the world is reminded of the fragility of stability. The illusion of safe zones is one of the foundations upon which diplomacy rests. Nations need to believe that there are places where dialogue can occur, where leaders can move, where negotiations can be staged without fear of intrusion. The strike in Doha cracks that illusion, even if only slightly, and cracks are dangerous because they can spread. Once a precedent is set, the mind begins to wonder if here, why not elsewhere? If now, why not again? Philosophically, this moment highlights how modern power operates less like a sword and more like a shadow. It is not only about what is destroyed, but about what is unsettled. Israel's action unsettles Hamas, unsettles Qatar, unsettles international norms, and unsettles the fragile architecture of mediation. And in unsettling so many layers at once, it forces the world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that wars today do not remain confined to the places we expect. They bleed outward, slipping into the cracks of diplomacy, into the sanctuaries of wealth, into the imagined safety of neutral ground. That is why the global and regional repercussions matter as much, if not more, than the immediate outcome of the strike. The surface may look calm, no leaders lost, no territory shifted, but beneath it, the tectonic plates of perception and power are grinding against each other. And history teaches us that when perception shifts, reality soon follows. The lesson is clear: when the spaces of peace become theaters of war, the world loses more than security. It loses the very ground upon which reconciliation could stand.